안녕하세요. 차윤아입니다. 여러분 기생충 영화 보신 적 있으신가요? 저는 이 기생충 영화 보면서 짜파구리 같은 혼성어는 과연 어떻게 번역이 될까 너무 궁금했었는데요. 저와 같은 생각을 하신 분들 계실 거라고 봅니다. 그래서 오늘은 영화 기생충의 번역을 직접 담당하신 달시파켓 교수님을 모시고 영상과 드라마 번역에 대해서 이야기 나눠보려고 하는데요. 교수님, 안녕하세요.
It's nice to meet you.
교수님께서 작업하신 작품들 중에서 가장 많이 알려진 작품, 아무래도 역시 기생충이 아닐까 싶은데요. 그 중에서도 가장 먼저 의뢰를 받은 작품은 어떤 거였나요?
The very first one that I did was Memories of Murder, also by Bong Joon-ho.
살인의 추억. 저도 정말 재밌게 봤습니다. 그런데 기생충도 그렇고 살인의 추억도 그렇고 봉준호 감독님이 만든 영화잖아요. 봉준호 감독님과 인연이 굉장히 좀 깊으신 것 같은데 처음에 자막 작업 의뢰받으셨을 때 기분이 어떠셨어요?
It was very exciting because I had worked with Bong Joon-ho on his very first film called Barking Dogs Never Bite. Simply doing proofreading, we sat down together and watched the film together and proofread the subtitles. So when he called me about Memories of Murder, I knew a lot about the film. I was very excited about the film, and even though this was my first opportunity to translate a film, I decided to jump in and take it.
네, 아무래도 처음 맡았던 작품이다 보니까 더 인상적이고 기억에 남으실 것 같은데요. 그렇다면 교수님, 영상 번역은 다른 문학 번역이나 웹툰 번역과는 좀 다른 종류라서 차이가 있을 것 같거든요. 어떤 점이 다른가요?
There are quite a few differences, but I mean, for me, one of the biggest differences is just the fact that you read the subtitles at the same time as you watch the actors on the screen. The subtitles don't replace the original text like they do with a novel, but you read them alongside the film itself. So the audience can feel the general mood of a certain scene. They can see the emotion in actors' faces. And so you have to match the translation to those very well.
교수님 말씀을 들어보니까 더 궁금한 게 많아지는 것 같습니다. 영화의 자막이 어떤 과정으로 들어가는지부터 또 궁금해지는데요. 영화의 제작 과정 중에서 자막 작업에 들어가는 시점은 언제부터인가요?
Usually I start work on subtitles before the film is finished because there are various deadlines for film festivals and other reasons that you need to finish the film quite early. And so when I work on the film, usually the sound mixing is not done, the CGI is not done. There's no particular special software that I use. Usually I just receive a screening link from the production company together with a list of the dialogue. And so I listen to the actors' voices and I divide up the dialogue according to the timing of the speech. And then I write in the translation below. Typically it takes me about 2 weeks to finish a translation. And then afterwards I receive emails and comments from the production company about requested changes. Occasionally I'll even meet with the director and go over the translation line by line, which can take a couple days but is worth it, I think. And then later when the film is done, then because there's some changes in the sound mixing and the editing, there may be some final small changes that need to be done before it's complete.
생각했던 것보다 굉장히 수정 작업을 많이 거치는군요. 그렇다면 퇴고라고 해야 되나요? 이 글을 다듬고 또 고쳐서 정리하는 작업이 있을 텐데 퇴고 과정도 굉장히 중요할 것 같아요.
Yes, I think revision is really one of the most important stages of the translation.
네, 이렇게 또 강조를 하시는 거 보니까 아마 퇴고의 중요성을 느낀 어떤 계기가 있지 않았을까 싶은데 구체적으로 좀 말씀해 주실 수 있으실까요?
It's true. I mean, at the beginning, I didn't recognize just how important the revision stage was. And so often I'd finish the translation and then I'd read through it again and I'd check everything. But I didn't take the time to watch the film completely and listen in detail and to go over again to every line. And I realized later that it's really important to do that. So, for example, In the revision stage, I often find ways to shorten the subtitles that hadn't occurred to me when I was doing the first draft. Or if there's a particularly challenging passage that cannot be translated literally, then I find solutions in the revision stage that hadn't occurred to me earlier. So in many ways, it does feel like you're using a different part of your brain when you're revising, compared to when you're doing the initial translation. So these days I always do take some time and make sure that I have enough time to really give the revision a lot of work.
네. 다음으로는 영상 번역가가 되기 위해서 갖춰야 될 능력이 뭘지에 대해서 또 질문을 드려보려고 하는데요. 자막 번역가가 되려면 단순히 외국어를 잘하는 것뿐만이 아니라 또 다른 기술이 필요할 것 같거든요. 자막 번역을 하면서 외국어 능력 외에 꼭 필요하다고 생각하는 능력이 있다면 어떤 걸까요?
Well, I think that, the most important thing is that you need to be able to write dialogue in a way that feels natural, which is not easy to do. I think that for even many native speakers, it's difficult to write dialogue that feels natural. One way to do that, I think, is to read a lot of books, and that people who read a lot are often good at translation and writing because they have those words in their head. And then apart from that, also a knowledge of film is really helpful because film is a particular kind of storytelling. And if you understand about how screenplays are constructed and how storytelling works in cinema, then it does really help with the translation as well. Those two things I think are some of the most important things.
그렇군요. 양쪽의 관점에서 사물을 보는 능력, 역시 단순히 외국어 능력뿐만이 아니라 문화적인 이해력, 그리고 대본에 대한 이해력도 필요한 직업인 것 같습니다. 그 밖에도 영화 자막 작업이라는 특수성 때문에 일할 때 많은 어려움도 있으셨을 것 같아요. 자막 번역할 때 가장 큰 어려움은 어떤 게 있으셨어요?
Because subtitles appear on the screen only briefly, it's important that the audience has enough time to read them before they disappear. And so it takes a lot of work to make the subtitles concise. This isn't a skill that comes naturally for the translator. On the other hand, it's also important to use vocabulary that is easy to understand at a glance. You don't want to simplify the text too much, but on the other hand, while preserving the complexity of the original dialogue, writing it in such a way that the meaning is direct and it can be understood quickly helps the audience a lot in understanding. So it's not something that comes naturally, but I think with practice, it becomes easier to write in this way.
네, 분명히 어려운 점들이 있으셨군요. 그런데 이 부분도 굉장히 쉽진 않았을 것 같아요. 특히 해외 관객에게 익숙하지 않을 수도 있는 그 문화들을 어떻게 번역 처리를 하는지 궁금한데요. 예를 들어서 영화 기생충에서는 짜파구리 같은 단어를 또 번역을 해야 되는데 이거는 한국에서만 쓰이는 단어이기 때문에 어떻게 번역을 할까 궁금했는데 램던으로 번역을 하셨어요. 이게 또 굉장히 화제가 됐습니다. 특히 서구 문화권에서는 이해할 수 없는 단어들일 텐데 이걸 또 새롭게 단어를 만들어서 훌륭하게 번역을 한 게 아닌가 싶은 생각이 드는데요. 이렇게 번역을 하려면 아무래도 한국 문화에 대해서 이해도가 굉장히 깊어야 될 것 같거든요. 이런 문화에 대한 정보는 어디서 얻으시는 편이신가요?
Well, I think it's really difficult to handle these instances because even though the Korean audience is very familiar with these elements, international audiences aren't, and they need to understand it sometimes in order to follow the movie. And so even something as simple as like 10,000 won, in some cases you can write it as $10 to make it easier for the audience to understand who might not be familiar with Korean currency. On the other hand, there are times when I feel like I don't want to erase the Korean element in the text. When you watch a Korean film from another country, if you can learn something about Korea, then that's a good thing, in my opinion. And so if it's possible to understand the situation without making this kind of substitution, for me, that's the best thing. Or in some cases, you can leave the original reference in the translation, but then add a little bit of explanation so that they can understand what it means. So ultimately, it's always case by case according to what the scene, what's going on in the scene, and what information the audience needs to have.
네, 교수님 말씀처럼 한국적인 것을 살리면서 또 외국인에게도 쉽게 설명할 수 있는 일은 쉽진 않은 일인 것 같은데 아무래도 교수님께서 하신 번역들은 또 외국인 입장에서 쉽게 이해하기 힘든 한국 문화적인 것들을 잘 살렸기 때문에 또 그만큼 한국 영화가 외국에서 더 큰 호응을 얻는데 아주 많은 역할을 하신 것 같습니다. 교수님께서는 기생충뿐만이 아니라 지난 20여 년 동안 150편 정도의 한국 영화 자막 번역 작업을 해오셨다고 들었거든요. 그렇다면 그 중에서 문화적인 맥락으로 번역은 어려웠지만 결과적으로 반응이 좋았던 번역 문구가 있다. 예를 들면 어떤 게 있을까요?
Well, one particularly challenging film for me to translate was director Yoon Jong-bin's The Spy Gone North, or Kongjak, which is concerned with the relationship between North and South Korea. In particular here, there are many references to the political situation in South Korea in the 1990s. And so I worried that international viewers would have a hard time following the story and that they wouldn't understand all of these references. There was also a huge amount of dialogue in the film in general, so I was worried that people might get exhausted reading so much text. So when the film premiered at Cannes, I read all of the reviews to see how critics reacted to it. And luckily, the film did get positive reviews, and some critics commented that the film presented a very complex story in a way that was clear and easy to understand. So I knew then that the translation was okay.
네, 아무래도 공작 같은 영화 같은 경우에는 이제 남북 관계라는 한국의 그런 역사적인, 문화적인 여러 가지 맥락들을 다 이해하셔야 되는데 평소에도 한국 영화나 책 같은 것들 많이 접하신 편이신가요?
I definitely watch a lot of Korean films. I spend much time trying to catch up on all of the new Korean films that come out. But I am, really interested in Korean culture in general. I love literature. I've been a fan of books all my life, and so I have been busy trying to read as many Korean novels as I can. So yeah, I'm trying to do both.
네, 그렇군요. 다음으로는 좀 변화하는 영상업계가 자막 번역 시장에 또 어떤 영향을 미치는지 궁금해서 여쭤볼 텐데요. OTT 시장이 확대하고 이로써 또 비서양 언어권 문화에 대한 관심이 커지고 있잖아요. 여기서 최근 영상 시장이 아주 많이 변화를 하고 있는 것 같아요. 특히 오징어 게임이 얼마 전에 넷플릭스에서 공개돼서 전 세계에서 인기를 끄는가 하면 또 한국계 미국인의 이야기를 다룬 미나리가 아카데미 시상식 작품상 후보에 오르기도 했었는데요. 과연 이런 변화가 한국 자막 번역 시장에는 어떤 영향을 미칠 거라고 보십니까?
Certainly there's a huge demand for translations of Korean content since all over the world they're so popular, and so production companies who are hoping to make films that target an international audience, for example, if they want to pitch their series to Netflix or to Apple, they need to translate the work into English first. And so high quality translation is really important. And the demand for translators is very high right now.
교수님이 더 앞으로 바빠지시겠어요?
Yes, I'm worried about that, but I'm doing my best.
네. 아무래도 한국 콘텐츠 자막 번역가들에게는 지금이 아주 시장에 진입하기가 좋은 시기가 될 것 같은데요. 코로나 시기를 지나면서 OTT 플랫폼 시장도 확대되면서 영화뿐만이 아니라 드라마 제작과 소비도 많이 늘었거든요. 자막 번역 시장에 진입하려는 사람들한테 OTT 시장도 아주 큰 기회가 될 수 있을 것 같은데요. OTT에서 TV 드라마랑 시리즈 번역도 영화 자막 번역하는 것처럼 같은 방식으로 진행이 되는 건가요?
If we just look at the translation itself, I think that they are quite similar. So there isn't much difference in translating a line of dialogue in a film compared with a TV drama or a series. On the other hand, the system is different, so that the translator, whereas in the film industry, they often make a contract directly with the film company. for the bigger platforms, there may be a vendor that acts as sort of like a middleman. And so the experience of translating for the platforms is often different for the translator in that sense. And because, especially, TV series are so long, it can be difficult for a single person to cover an entire work by themselves. Then often you have a number of different people working together on one project. So in that case, it's you need to do things to make sure that the translation is consistent within this work where several different translators are taking part.
말씀하신 것처럼 만약에 여러 사람들이 같이 공동으로 작업을 하게 되면 드라마나 시리즈물 같은 경우에는 용어가 막 다르게 번역이 될 수도 있잖아요. 이런 걸 통일하는 것도 굉장한 일일 것 같은데 어떤 식으로 작업이 되는 건가요?
Generally, when you have multiple people working on the same project, then you make what's called a K&P list, which stands for key names and phrases. And so basically, it's just a list of all the names and special terms that are repeated throughout the film, together with the agreed upon translation. So as you're going through the work and translating, you can follow the translations that are on this list. And then more generally, it can also just make sense for the translators to have a conversation among themselves before they start the translation, to discuss things like the overall tone and style. And then afterwards, either one person or perhaps the group together can read over the whole text and make sure that it feels consistent.
만약에 의견이 다르면 어떻게 되나요?
Yeah, there has to be some compromise. If one person's very much in charge, then they can make the decisions. Otherwise, it's a group decision.
네, 교수님 마지막으로 혹시 자막 번역가가 되고 싶은 사람들에게 조언을 해주신다면?
In general, I would recommend to watch a lot of films, to read a lot of books, to practice translation, just to improve your skills. But in a more practical sense, the Literature Translation Institute of Korea does have various programs to train people in media translation. And so I'd recommend to look on their site and see what's available. And then there are other ways that you can perhaps try to meet people within the film industry, because usually it's through one's personal connections that you find your first job. So for example, volunteering at a film festival could be a good way to meet different people who work in the film industry, and that could very well lead you to getting a job in the future.
네, 오늘 나와주셔서 또 좋은 말씀 해주셔서 너무나도 감사드립니다. 자, 지금까지 영상 번역에 대해서 달시파켓 교수님과 함께 이야기 나눠봤는데요. 앞으로도 달시파켓 교수님 번역하신 좋은 작품들 많이 기다리고 또 기대해 보겠습니다. 고맙습니다.
고맙습니다.